Good evening. This is Middle Child, and I am John Edward Willie, and it feels great to be doing what I love best, which is walking and talking and thinking aloud and recording myself and enjoying this cool night air. It's Wednesday, July 10th, and it's about 70 something degrees. And I have to say that it feels good to be recording an audio alone. And of course, I am recording while I'm walking, but I'm just now finishing the attempt to do multiple video recordings of myself thinking aloud. And in my failure to do so, I sort of realized that there might be great benefit to recording my voice alone. And so I'm returning to this medium, and I'm speaking kind of slowly, thinking that if I'm speaking too slowly for you, you could always speed yourself up. When I listen to recordings, I often increase the speed or take my time sometimes to listen casually. And so I think you can do the same. And what I mean to do in speaking slowly is in finding my own rhythm and in finding my own step. Because, thinking is like walking. Not to point out the obvious, there's a circularity to both. There's a beneficial quality to both. And there's a sense in which each is partaking in a certain kind of wandering. Now, this might sound like, I'm trying too hard to sound erudite, or I'm thinking about anything, because maybe there is a sense in which I'm saying anything just to say it, because I'm hoping to sort of spark myself into finding what it is that I want to say by sort of feeling my way around the thoughts that are brewing in my head. And I don't know any other way except to begin. And there's a sense in which, in my own chaos and disorder, I tend to go astray. And so I suppose that gives me a hesitation, given the uncontrollable quality in what I say, that I can't allow that to stop me from trying. And so if I'm confusing, then please forgive my confusion. And if I'm obtuse, then please confuse that also. I suppose the question that anyone has when they're recording is, who are you recording for? It's the question that anyone who creates or writes is asked. Who are you doing it for? And many people like to say that they're doing it for everybody, that they write for a general audience, or that they create art that is seeking out a universal effect. Or then you have those who speak of the inverse, which is to suggest that they make art or they write for themselves. I'm not sure why it is that I do what I do. But I do know that it's a function of who I am. And if there's chaos in this, it's because thinking is inherently chaotic. And a part of what I'm recording and doing this is capturing the inherent limitations of thinking, in the sense that I'm attempting to reflect an embodied person thinking. And it sounds silly to hear myself speaking aloud, but I have to speak so that I can then listen to myself and then sort of decide whether or not I want to release what I say. And so I suppose I'm doing poorly so far, but my intent is there. And so what I mean to philosophize about, or what I mean to speak about, is what it is that I'm doing here in these recordings. And I guess I'm sort of also worrying whether I'm being boring or not, but I'm just going to keep on talking. Because this is very much like a sketchbook in motion. And I think that what I'm going to do is just go back and listen to myself anyways, at a 1.6 speed as I do, and feel out whether or not there's anything here. Because I realize that what I can do with these recordings is that besides use them like directly as recordings, I can also use them as springboards for my writing. Because it seems that my writing takes off when it mirrors the natural flow of my own syntax or whatever. Because there's a sense in which you can't decide how you're going to speak, that you can't decide how you're going to write, that it has to come out naturally, because the writing and the speaking is not a means in itself. There's something like a proposition being conveyed, and that conveyance is complicated by the degree to which you're caught up in trying to live up to some prescribed norm, in the sense that one is actually performing something that is more spontaneous than that. And to think that it's doing one thing while it's doing something else is to miss the point altogether, which is that something is being said. And you could say that that's like the sort of the failure of the person who has nothing to say but tries to say it. It's sort of like a person who's trying to be something without realizing that they are what they already are. And right now in my own back of my own mind, while I'm speaking, is severe self-doubt, because in thinking that I'm going to even put out this recording that I'm making, there's a part of me that is screaming, stop. And even hesitating and listening to that isn't partially what prevents me from calling forth my own power to speak. Because it's interesting, because there's sort of a question, what is required to speak? What are the imperatives in thinking? Because I think there's things that are demanded that are not really built into the way that we educate ourselves or think about what we are. And what I mean to say is that thinking is inherently dangerous. And obviously that's a Nietzschean thing that I picked up, in the sense that it comes from Friedrich Nietzsche. And it means that to think, you have to make a kind of assertion or affirmation that isn't necessarily justified in the classical detached way that we think about logic, in the sense that on a certain level one has to live out the difficult implications of ideas if you believe them, if they're to be something more than an idea. And that puts certain demands on a person, because that means that there are consequences to your thinking. And yeah, I don't mean that, because what I mean to really say is that to have a thought at all, you have to have a certain kind of confidence that you don't have by playing the neutral game, or by by pretending to be innocent. I suppose that to have a thought at all, you have to have an inclination of your own evil, not evil, but your own, you have to have an inclination of your own capacity to transgress, to overstep those boundaries. One has to have an innate ability to cross those boundaries if you're going to think at all, and that's not something that is instinctive to most people, in the sense that we rear ourselves to be especially tolerant, and that tolerance means that we don't allow ourselves to have an offensive thought. And it doesn't mean that you live out these thoughts, but to have the courage to have a thought at all, to allow yourself to have a thought. When we hear something new, our tendency is to flex up. Our tendency, naturally, given the amount of bullshit that's around us, our tendency is to freeze up and deny and reject. And the only reason I say this is that I'm speaking from my own experience. Not to say that that means anything, but it means that if I've learned anything, it's that, well, now I've lost my own train of thought because I got so excited about having that thought. But maybe you lost my train of thought as well. So we can just start over. But what I mean to say is that if there's anything that I've learned, it's that to have a thought takes a certain level of confidence. That means overriding that cacophony of voices within that are saying, as the voices that are speaking to me right now in the back of my mind are saying, stop speaking, you have no right to speak, you were violating a certain boundary. And you could say that some of us are, for whatever reason, put into worlds or born into worlds where we're not entitled to have a thought. Like, we're not entitled to have a position. Everything is already known. All you can do is conform to the experience of others. And that's not a judgment of my own experience or others, but I think a fundamental condition of thinking, if thinking is to be more than logical deduction, if thinking is to be more than simply syllogistic leaping, or if thinking is to be more than just endless play, but if it is to have a dimension that is what we call critical investigation, if thinking is to be critical at all, it has to be able to be attuned to our bodies, in the sense that we are animals, in the sense that being aggressive or having a capacity for aggression is key. And I don't know why I'm even thinking this, except that there's a certain level of confidence that one has to assert that can also, at the same time, lead you to being burned, can lead you to being crushed. And so there's a sense in which one is trying to mitigate as much as one can the consequences of this pushing. And there's a level at which, as one person I used to know said, it depends on how far you want to push it. There's a sense in which every idea can be pushed and pushed and pushed, and you end up in extremes. And can you wear those extremes? Can you bear those extremes? If you're going to push yourself in terms of ideas about what you are and what your potential is, and then you're going to live out those ideas, can you take all that? Can you wear all that? And if you're going to give up and go on the other side of the extreme, can you bear that? There's a sense in which that middle path is found when you are cognizant of how much you can bear. And that can mean a lot of things, because it can also mean that you're lying to yourself. And our capacity to lie to ourselves is a problem that it goes beyond philosophy, because it's before philosophy. And I guess that's one idea that I think is very interesting, because not only do I sort of think that there are perhaps no metaphysical questions whatsoever, but that even what we think of as fundamental problems may not be problems. But that perhaps is for another day, because I suppose that I sort of experience problems. I suppose that I sort of begin with that notion that it is sort of a part of who I am. And yes, right here, I am sort of just, again, for the second time in this recording, speaking just to speak. And the reason for that, for speaking just to speak in my own monologues, is because I'm carrying my own music. And I suppose that it's sort of, speaking of naturally having problems or questions, the question that emerges to me, and questions are always emerging within my own experience that lead me to being philosophical, but I can still sort of see how there are no philosophical problems, but that what I experience as problems are sort of speculative glimmerings, that radiate off of what we see and think and experience, but it's not that they're necessarily real, but that they sort of just happen. And so I'm always amazed by the way that questions emerge, because you could say that all questions are purely technical, that you can only ask questions that you can answer, and that there's no point in asking questions that you cannot answer. And I would like to go along with that, except that I'm always asking questions I can't answer. So I'm always contradicting myself. And I don't know what else to do except to record myself being confused by my own confusion and being unable to know where to start, and then finding myself not knowing where to go, almost as if there were no ending and no beginning, but that I guess there is a formal quality to what I do, because what's strange is that one doesn't think in a vacuum. One thinks and functions according to a set of perimeters, regardless of whether or not one is aware of them, and it's against those perimeters that one thinks. And I suppose that it's up to the individual to choose those standards by which they judge their own values, experience, expectations. And I guess that there's a sense in which a part of what we do in education is supposedly to prepare students for that choice. But I doubt whether they have any real sense of which there is a choice at all, because it's not presented essentially as such. It's sort of the programmatic instrumental always makes its way in, because for obvious reasons, we're just amazed at the world that we've made. We're just so overwhelmed by it, I suppose, that what we experience is a world that's constantly changing, and it seems to get better so long as we agree and play by the rules. Woo! And I'm not a Heideggerian, and I don't really know if I side with Aristotle either, but I do think that wonder is a fundamental component of thinking as well. So I'd spoken a little about how thinking dangerous is an important part of thinking at all, to have the confidence to have an assertion, to cross that boundary. Well, I think that perhaps wonder is also another beginning, and it was Aristotle who I mentioned, because he had said that philosophy begins in wonder. And it's also that philosophy ends in wonder, because To Aristotle, it is the end and the beginning of philosophy. But I'm not so sure that I can even relate to that, given how foreign he is to me, you know. But I think that there's a sense in which Heidegger, who I mentioned also, is right when he says that we are missing what is most obvious. You know, because I'm speaking about Martin Heidegger, the German phenomenologist or ontologist, and you know what he ultimately suggests is that the very background of our experience is what's missed by us insofar as we are transfixed by a particular way of relating to our immediate experience. And you know, you can speak about Heidegger endlessly because he is so fascinating at the same time that he is quite infuriating for various reasons. But one thing he sort of gets right, I think, is that we are missing ontology itself, that there's something about the immediacy of our world that we are missing, and you can call that wonder. I mean, you could call it the astonishment at being, but you know, I don't think it has to be a mystical experience, and I don't think it has to be something that is understood to be rapturous. And it's not that it has to do with, and this is another side of Heidegger that's fascinating, but it doesn't have to do with reducing being to the background of being, insofar as the way that I think of it is you are attempting to then explain away every particular in terms of some structural whole, whether it be Heidegger or in his historicism, or even Kant's transcendental deduction, or Jung or Freud, or even Nietzsche, if you want to attempt to systematize Nietzsche, which I don't think you can do. But what I mean to say is that it's not that we want to lose ourselves in bewilderment and wonderment, because I think that on a certain level, that's impossible. And not only that, but it quickly becomes ideological, if not ideational. And so, at the same time, the question then is, what is wonder? You know, at least when I was younger, it's sad to say, but I guess this experience can dim over time. But I used to wake up more and more with a sense of astonishment at my own being. You know, you might call it the inverse of nihilism, because to me it's still a fundamental feature of my own experience, and it's why I'm not a nihilist. But that in itself is another whole body of thought that I'll have to leave for another recording. But I think that it's also related to what could be associated with the fantasy, or with a kind of escapism, because to me, at the same time that I was astonished by everything, you know, I was also unable to function on a practical level, because partially the only way you philosophize at all is by forgetting about the past and the future, and detaching in such a way that you lose yourself in something that isn't necessarily connected with the immediacy of your own world. And I don't know, but I suspect that if you're being paid to philosophize as well, that you could also ultimately be losing contact with this thing that potentially undoes what it is that you're ostensibly doing. Now, that sounds offensive and, again, obtuse, but I put it forth as being a fundamental element of what I'm attempting to do here. And if I have to explain it by now, it won't make as much sense. And so I'll restate the point, sort of before I forget it, but that philosophy is an incredible thing, but it's not what life is. And, one of my favorite philosophers, David Hume, I think, understood this. And it has to do with seeing the difference between the life of the mind and our actual life. Now, a lot of people in the English and Anglo-Saxon tradition are taken to take this too far, and they're accused of what's called reductivism in regards to their materialism and their empiricism. And they're understood to be instrumental, and I'm using a lot of fancy terms, not because I want to, but because I'm used to, and I would like over time in these recordings not to use so many names and so many words. So bear with me. But it's understood to many people, and I think partially it's mistaken and it's false, but it's understood that the scientific world is disenchanted. It's understood that the English tradition of an empiricism, from John Locke to David Hume, and then to figures like Bertrand Russell and even Wittgenstein, it's understood to have lost a sense of enchantment, a sense of romance. And I think that's mistaken, because I think that what's attempting to be explained by figures like David Hume ultimately carries with it its own form of mystery and bewilderment, except that it's a much more modest and composed sense of what all this is, because it's also understood in relation to other things that may or may not be outside of philosophy as we have properly understood it. And so I go back to David Hume, and David Hume is a figure that has not escaped me because I have not escaped him. And David Hume is fundamental not only because of what he did in philosophy, but also because of what he understood intuitively in regards to what philosophy is. So it's what he did in philosophy, but it's also what he did in relation to philosophy. And not to be reductive myself, but you could say that his sentence, that you can, and I don't know the sentence verbatim, but the sentence is more or less, to be a philosopher is a great thing, but it's more important to be a man. I think he says that if you must be a philosopher, then philosophize, but be a man first. God, I'm really butchering that, but what he's effectively saying is that we're humans first before we think. And it's strange to people outside of philosophy. It's strange to people outside of the circles of intellectuals, but there's an increasing number of people who, for various reasons, it's not that I disagree with all of it, but they effectively don't believe that we have experience at all. There's a lot of people who effectively take David Hume and his skepticism and ultimately doubt everything. And that in itself is for another recording or even for writing, but that in itself is to misunderstand what David Hume said in relation to philosophy, the second quality of David Hume, which is that you must be a man first, because in many ways that means that once you exhaust the limits of skepticism, it's not nihilism that awaits. There's no vacuum there. It's the immediacy of life that comes in, whether it's in just the obvious qualities of experience, the plenitude that is offered to our senses in terms of, you can hear the cicadas, right? So you can hear the wind. It's not that I'm an animist or I believe that we have for the longest time lived in active participatory relation with the sensory world around us, but I do think that in our And our souls, if we have a souls, it is connected to a fundamental sense of life in a language that is not philosophical, because it is, to use philosophical language, bodily. And that's another tradition that comes out of David Hume's radical empiricism. And that's the tradition that doesn't lead to the kind of solipsistic, relativistic, hyper skepticism of earlier, but it's a kind of skepticism that then opens up to what is called phenomenology. And in many ways, what I think is that, not that my opinion matters, but we need a phenomenology without phenomenology. The word itself butchers the entire project from the beginning. You know, it's such a lugubrious term. And it bewilders me that the writing is so bad often, you know, from Heidegger to my beloved Maurice Merleau-Ponty. It's so bad that we miss what is crucial. And, you know, I could say that to people outside of the philosophical world, it seems crazy that this would be missed, but people outside of academic and intellectual circles are missing a lot themselves. So that should be said also. But I think because I'm thinking against one tradition rather than another, it has to be said that what is to be recovered is the body, because people who live their lives inside of books, inside of their minds, they lose track of this nitty-gritty, funky little detail, which is that we are bodies, we are brains. We are not, it's not that I'm saying that we are evolutionary creatures, but that we are to be understood as thinking creatures in a world. And that's why I don't personally fall into what's called subjectivism, which is the idea that our experience is determining the nature of the world, or that the world is a product of our subjective experience, or that we do not have access to the world in itself. I think all of that has been largely overrun by leaps in 20th century philosophy. And I've mentioned a few figures, but what's often lacking in a lot of this work is the work itself fails to live up to the demands that are made, which is that we have to speak as embodied creatures. And that's why I speak in this recording as someone that doesn't really have control of what he says. You know, I'm sort of like a musician who has lost his way and who is performing for himself in the cemetery, because I've been reading and attempting to write and attempting to record for a very long time now. And it seems that the longer I go without actually doing anything physical, the further I seem to disappear. And so there's a kind of push in me to get this out. And I know that if it's especially bad, I can cut it out. But it's likely that, probably out of laziness, I'll leave a lot of it in. But it's also because rather than obsess over what I'm recording, I suppose that my instinct is just to record it better next time, if that makes sense. And I suppose it's because one of my best friends is a jazz musician, and I learned a lot in proximity to the jazz musician's life, because a lot of it has to do with a growth that comes from learning that when you make a mistake as a musician, you just don't do it again, but you go about recording it again. And you could say that that's a differing quality between musicians, whether popular or local. And it has to do with whether they're referring to something when they play, or whether they're embodying that playing itself. And I want to embody philosophy, because there's a tradition that if you do philosophy, you're living against. And that's what I brought up before, in the sense that there are certain standards that you go about choosing. And the philosophy that I do, you're not doing it on your own, willy-nilly. You're only able to do it because, as Picasso said, you can only break the rules once you master them. And you could say that the thing about jazz is that upon mastering the classical tradition, what can they do but play spontaneously upon it? But as Picasso said, again, you have to learn the rules in order to break them. And so you must learn Plato and Kant, and you must measure yourself against them. And you must see that what they're doing in their work is of the highest magnitude in regards to the possibility of thought. Because if in literature it's Shakespeare, then in philosophy it's certainly Immanuel Kant and Plato and Hume and Nietzsche and so forth. And again, this is only a preliminary remark, but it has to do with the fact that I myself think in regards to this tradition, and yet at the same time, I'm not thinking as a way of replacing life with thinking. And so I don't really think that there's any explanation of life. I think life reveals itself to us, but that when we think, we're ultimately not only learning how to be more critical, in the sense of learning how to actively make better choices based on more acute standards of reasoning and evidence, in the sense that we become the best kind of person we can be, but that on a deeper level, you're sort of pursuing something that has to do with the formation of the soul, if the soul exists at all. And in the humanist tradition, it isn't understood to be a soul that is separate from the body, but it is a soul that can ultimately, I think in a secular way, understood to be, it's a soul that is understood to be character, and character is a fascinating idea, and it's largely out of favor in our time. And again, this is another thing to record about or write about, but it has to do with the ways in which, within liberalism and within the humanist tradition, there is a certain kind of subjectivity, a form of subjectivity, you could call it. There's a tradition of individualism that ultimately splinters, not that it was ever unified, but it splinters in various ways. And so the question then becomes, what kind of self are you becoming? Because the self that you see promoted in bookstores today, and bookstores are increasingly, if they exist at all, are dominated by self-help books, And I remember a period when my beloved philosophy section disappeared one shelf at a time to the new age and self-help books. But there's a difference between the kind of self that is talked about in Tony Robbins or Napoleon Hill, and the self that is talked about in, for instance, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And I know that there's definitely a comedic quality to his autobiography, but what was understood to be the self in Benjamin Franklin, I think, is also the self that you find in figures like Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche is a more romantic, obviously, in the sense that he's very influenced by the German romantic tradition. But for Benjamin Franklin, the self isn't merely reduced to the accumulation of money. It's not a capitalist self. It's a self that is understood to be in relation to virtues that we don't take seriously. We see them as deceptive, self-deceptive, and those are virtues like courage, honesty, integrity. And it has to do with a longer tradition, whether it's religious or not, and it's a tradition by which you think about other people in terms of the formation of their own soul, or what I would call character. And so if education means anything in regards to something that isn't merely about technical information, but is about the formation of a self, then what is philosophy in regards to that? You know, if philosophy is the love of wisdom, then what ultimately is that wisdom? You know, what is the content of that wisdom? I remember discovering the definition of philosophy when I was young, and since I wrote everything down as a habit of taking notes, I began with the definition of philosophy, and it struck me that there was a sort of gap between what it said and what I then found, because it begins with the love of wisdom. And I remember very dimly, very dimly thinking, well, what is this wisdom? And much later I thought, well, what is this love? You know, because I never really associated love with philosophy, you know, but it's in the definition. You know, I don't speak Greek, but I know it's philosophia, Sophia, the love of wisdom. Well, what is this wisdom? In philosophy, is it something that's a part of the Gnostic secret traditions? Is this wisdom something that is esoteric? Is this something that is metaphysical? Is this wisdom something that is hidden? Is it something that can even be nailed down? You know, how could we nail down wisdom? What is wisdom? Is it just a big joke? Is it? You know, is it? It's indicative of our age to think it's a joke and to be cynical in response to thinking at all means that, doesn't mean that you come from our culture because it's universal, but it means that you no longer take seriously, or you never took seriously, the idea of becoming something more than what you are. And that's fine because it could be correct. And a lot of people don't have philosophical problems. You know, a lot of people are just simply here, and that's not a put down. It's just that there are certain types of people who experience reality in such a way, or have taken on beliefs in such a way that they see themselves, as I do, as being on a path. And this path is ultimately fantastical. You know, it's strange because once one rejects metaphysics, or one at least learns to resist superstition and to resist anything that can't be experienced, you know, you ultimately run into these kind of complexities. But I think that the formation of the self and what wisdom really is in the body. It's in the senses. And I don't really speak about that ever because it's very arcane, but given that this is my recording, I can say whatever I want, and I'm just kidding. But it means that what I think is that the highest form of intelligence has nothing to do with, or doesn't have everything to do with, the retaining of information, or the capacity to make distinctions, or even the capacity to think syllogistically, or to do anything in terms of greatness, insofar as it perhaps has much more to do with the basic everyday awareness of the world around us. And it could be that the value of life and the value and meaning of being alive isn't found in reference to something outside of this world, but it's found in the world itself, but not, again, in a mystical way. It's found in the immediacy of this world. And it could be that the shape of our attention in terms of our ability to hear, listen, and partake in this world around us is ultimately where philosophy begins, if it's where philosophy ends. But anyways, I appreciate you listening. If anyone is still listening to this recording, as I said, it's July the 10th, And it is the twilight hour with the sun going down. And this is the waking mess. And this is Middle Child. And I'm John Edward Willie.